Star Walker Studios presents Game Master's Journey, your multidimensional RPG podcast. Hello, fellow gamer. Welcome to episode 175 of Game Master's Journey. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker, and on this show, we discuss the craft and the art of game mastering. I've been running RPGs for over 25 years now, and I produce this show in the hopes that you can benefit from my experience, my triumphs, and my mistakes. I've got a great show for you today. We're going to wrap up our exploration of Chapter 1 of the Dungeon Master's Guide with a discussion on flavors of fantasy. So I'm really excited to complete Chapter 1 today. I had no idea when I started this series of episodes that it would take me so long just to get through the first chapter of the DMG. Now, it's completely possible that other chapters won't take so long. I don't know. Chapter 1 does have a lot of world building material, which is very germane to this show. So there was a lot that I wanted to talk about in Chapter 1. Could be that some other chapters we may get through more quickly. For instance, I'm thinking of the chapter with all the magic items in it. I don't plan on going through every single magic item. So, maybe that one won't take quite as long. I don't know. That said, if there is a specific magic item or if there's something specific in the DMG that you want me to talk about when we get to that part of it, let me know. You can reach me at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. And, for instance, magic items, if there's a specific magic item that people want to hear about, then I'll be happy to talk about it. But going through all of them would take forever. I mean, I guess we could do that. If you want me to do that, let me know. But yeah, that would take a really long time. So I've done a whole series of episodes where I started with the Player's Handbook, and I went through the Player's Handbook and talked about mainly the GM relevant material in the Player's Handbook. So I didn't so much talk about more player focused stuff like the classes and abilities and spells and stuff like that. I'm more focused on the general rules of the game and running the game, what is relevant and of interest to GMs who want to run D&D. And now I've started going through the Dungeon Master's Guide. And as always with these episodes, if you go to the show notes for this episode 175 over at starwalkerstudios.com/gamemastersjourney/175, I will have links to all the episodes in this series, including the episodes on the Player's Handbook, in the show notes for this episode, as I do all these episodes, so that you can find the other ones in the series, because I do other topics on the show. Not every episode of Game Master's Journey is one of these episodes. So that way you can, if you're wanting to get caught up on the series, you can do that. And speaking of the episodes of Game Master's Journey, I've just recently released some more of the back episodes into the public stream. Specifically, I released some of the older world building episodes. So I've done, I think, over 20 now world building episodes where I've talked about my world I'm creating for my D&D games called Primordia, and I've taken you along through the process. So I've made some of those earlier episodes available for a limited time. And again, patrons of the show can get access to all of the back episodes of Game Master's Journey, which now, this is our 175th episode. They can also get access to all of the GM Intrusions episode, which was the precursor to this podcast, which was a podcast very similar to this one, only more focused on Numenera. So patrons get access to all of that. But right now you can all get access to some more of the older world building episodes. So definitely check those out if you're interested, and listen to them, because they're not going to be in the public feed forever. But we've been talking about world building a lot lately, so I thought it would be cool to put some of the older episodes in there. It's a little hard for me because I feel like the older episodes of the show are not as good as the more recent episodes. I feel like the show is constantly improving, so it's a little hard for me to hear some of those older episodes, but I know that listeners enjoy them. So for now, at least, you can check those out. So please do so while you still can. I want to remind you at the top of the show that you can now get Game Master's Journey t-shirts. We have a store over on Spreadshirt. I always screw that up. And my wife, Nikki, designed the shirts. They feature logos and artwork from Game Master's Journey, as well as my D&D adventure, The Trickster's Labyrinth, which is an adventure I published for D&D. And you can find the link to our store on Spreadshirt, as well as information on how you can get a hold of The Trickster's Labyrinth on the website over at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey. So check that out. Also, want to let you know that Game Master's Journey Star Walker Studios now has a Discord server. So this is a place where you can go and chat in real time with other listener GMs. And it's been doing really well. We've had this up for a few weeks now, and we've got, I don't know, I think 30 or more people that are in the server now, and starting to have some discussions in there. The other cool thing about Discord is, in addition to chat channels, you can have voice channels. So I do have a voice channel set up right now that people can go jump into that and actually talk to each other using their mouths and their words instead of having to type onto a screen. So, we've had a community for Game Master's Journey over on Google Plus for a long time now, and it's a very active and vibrant community. And honestly, is pretty much the only RPG community I pay much attention to on Google Plus anymore, because the rest of them have far more noise than Signal, if you know what I mean, and also sometimes are not moderated fairly well, and you'll find the occasional douchebag. We don't have any douchebags in the Game Master's Journey community. Everybody's super awesome in there, and we have a lot of listener GMs who ask questions and share ideas and things from their games, from their campaigns, from their adventures, share things about their homebrew settings, and all kinds of great stuff. So you can check that out. But the Discord kind of serves a different need, because the Discord server is in real time. So, you can, as soon as you hit enter on your message, it shows up and you can go back and forth with people, and you can get in the voice channel and actually talk to people like you would talk to someone in real life. And very soon, Discord is going to have video chat. I don't know if we'll be able to have a public video chat channel or not. I don't know if people would even want that. But I'm really excited about the video chat, because I am hoping it will be up and running by the time I start my next campaign, The Hinterlands of Elandria. And I'm really hoping to use their video chat for my game, which I will be streaming on my YouTube channel, so you can watch that. So yeah, another thing just here at the top of the show to talk about real quick, you've probably noticed some extra episodes for the month of August. In fact, that you've been getting 2 episodes a week. Those additional episodes are the previous live streams that we've done. We've got another live stream coming up for September. Live streams are always on the first Wednesday of the month. So the next one will be on Wednesday, September 6th. And those are from 3 to 4 p.m. Pacific time. And those are on my YouTube channel, and you can get in our chat room and talk live with me and the other people in the audience. And I come to the live stream with things to talk about, but my hope with those is really that people in the audience will ask questions and suggest topics, and I really want to talk about what you want to talk about. But I do bring a topic in case, people don't have suggestions or questions or anything like that. So, you can see that live on YouTube when it happens. You can also see them later on YouTube and see the video. But I've also started putting the audio into the podcast feed for those of you who don't have the time to sit down and watch YouTube, which is honestly me. I don't hardly ever have time to sit and watch YouTube, but I've got lots of time to listen to podcasts. So I know I'm not the only one out there like that. So for those of you that fit in that category, I'm making those available in the feed and will from now on. So I do a bonus episode of the show every month because we've reached a milestone on our Patreon that gives us a bonus episode every month. And I was thinking that I would just count those as the bonus episodes, even though for those of you that watch the YouTube, they're not really, it's not new material. You've probably already seen it. But I think I might actually do a bonus episode for August on top of that. So we're caught up. So we would have only had one episode this week, the week that you're hearing this, the last week of August. But if I have the time and if I can get it put together, I think I'll do a bonus episode for August. And I think what I'm going to do is cover some feedback I've gotten on various topics and talk about some other, what I call micro topics. Although when I talk to them about them, they tend not to be very micro, but kind of shorter topics that I don't want to base an entire episode on, but that I want to talk about. So hopefully I can get that out later this week. And yeah, that'll be a lot of episodes for August. So for those of you scrambling to catch up, yeah, good luck with that. But then now that the live stream episodes are caught up for September, we'll just have the 2 bonus episodes in addition to the regular weekly episodes. We'll have the live stream episode and we'll have the bonus episode. So September, we'll be back to our schedule of only having 2 episodes every other week instead of every week. So hopefully that'll help those of you that are having a hard time keeping up. So let's see. Go through my notes real quick here. Make sure I cover everything I wanted to cover at the top of the show before we dig into our DMG, because once we dig into the DMG, it's all over at that point. Yeah, I think that's it. So definitely check out our Discord server. I'll have a link for that in the show notes so that you can sign up. And yeah, I'd love to see you in there. And we're just trying to build more community around Game Master's Journey so that GMs can network and so we can learn from one another and share stories, because one thing as a GM that can be rough if you don't have other GMs who are friends of yours who are not also players in your game is sometimes as a GM, you feel like you got no one to talk to. Because you want to talk about maybe your world you're homebrewing, or you want to talk about your campaign that you're running. And you can't really do that with the players because you don't want to spoil things. You can have a nice conversation about a campaign with the players once it's over. But otherwise, you don't want to have those conversations with the players. And especially, if your players aren't themselves GMs, they're not going to have that perspective that another GM will have. So, I know that a lot of us are kind of out on our own. We've got a few people that we game with and that's it. So through the Discord server and through our community on Google+, we can network with other GMs and share stories and ask questions and give advice and all that good stuff. And that is something that I would love to see more of in the Discord server and on the community. So, feel free. Sometimes I hear from people that are like, oh, I don't know if I should post this or not. As far as the Discord server and as far as the community, if it's RPG related, it's fine. The only thing that I've ever had a problem with people posting on the community is spam. Whether that's just some random person that joins the community and posts some ad for something that has nothing to do with RPGs, or someone that comes in and wants to advertise their Kickstarter or whatever. If you're in there just to advertise, then, our community is not the place for that. There are plenty of other RPG communities on Google+. That's what they're all about. And you can go do that there. So unless you're promoting things, you should be fine. And as long as you're at all on topic. So, if you want to talk about your latest game session, if you want to talk about, maybe a conflict you're having with a player and ask other GMs how they would handle it, or anything related to playing or running RPGs, you've got the green light, whether it's the Discord server or the Game Master's Journey community. Now, Game Master's Journey community over in Google+, I do try to keep focused on RPGs. The Discord server, I'm not concerned about that. You don't have to just talk about RPGs on the Discord server. You can talk about whatever you want. As long as you're respectful to people and you're not offending people, you can talk about whatever you want. And when it gets to the point that we have enough users and we have enough kind of different conversations going on, I can make more Discord rooms that are for specific conversations. So I could have an off-topic room or whatever. Right now, there's just the one room because there aren't that many people using the server at any one time, and it hasn't gotten unwieldy yet, but it will. And when it does, I'll make more rooms. But I will always have a place where you can talk about whatever you want to talk about. So yeah, kind of feel free, as long as you're respecting other people and you're not making problems, it shouldn't be an issue. So yeah, I'm really all about building community and networking. I get on the horn on this show every week and talk to you about running games, but I just have one perspective, right? And there's a lot of perspectives out there on running games. So the more people we can hear from, the better. At least that's what I think. So that, I think, is enough of the preliminary stuff. And let's get on to our main topic. All right, time for our main topic today, which is from the first chapter of the Dungeon Master's Guide. And today we're talking about flavors of fantasy. And, I got to tell you, I debated quite a bit whether to even talk about this portion of the book, but I finally decided to talk about it, but I don't want to spend a ton of time on it. So I might kind of power through this, and hopefully this won't be a super long episode, because honestly, when they're talking about flavors of fantasy, they're talking about actually a couple different things here. They're kind of mixing a couple different things together. One thing they're talking about here is really what we would call subgenres of fantasy, which is to say, when you look at fantasy as literature, fantasy is a subgenre of fiction, and fantasy itself has subgenres. You've got swords and sorcery, you've got epic fantasy, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, modern fantasy or urban fantasy, historical fantasy. There's all kinds of subgenres. And I tell you what, I was originally thinking, I'll go through them all, but you just do a little digging online and you'll find that there are dozens of subgenres that people consider for fantasy. And it's hard to find two people who agree on what an exhaustive list of subgenres of fantasy would be. And I think that's partly because, all it takes is some unique idea and boom, you've got a new subgenre of fantasy. So, I'm sure we haven't seen all of them that we'll see in the future. And some of them are very, very niche. So part of what they're talking about here when they're talking about flavors of fantasy is really subgenres of the fantasy genre that you can try to emulate in your game or take some direction from for your game. And then they're kind of, I don't know if I want to say they're confusing it, but they're kind of juxtaposing that or combining that also with just kind of different types of campaigns. So they're kind of, I don't know. I don't know that Flavors of Fantasy is the best title for this section. I think maybe Flavors of Campaign might be a better way to say this, because some of these they're talking about in here I don't think are really considered by many people to be a subgenre of fantasy. It's more a type of D&D campaign you could play. So one thing I want to point out at the beginning of this is, if you want to learn about the different types of fantasy and the different subgenres of fantasy, this isn't the place to learn it. There are much better sources for that information on the internet. And again, they're not going to agree with one another. Everybody kind of looks at it differently and considers different subgenres important, and others can be grouped together and things like that. But there's lots of discussion online that you can find about all the different types of fantasy that are out there. So, this is not a primary source for that. I would not rely on the DMG to educate you about things that aren't D&D, because that's not its purpose, and it definitely would not be an adequate resource for that. The other thing I want to point out is, these are examples of different ways you could flavor your campaign, different ways you could flavor your game, different ways you could flavor your setting. And I mean, this seems really obvious to me and probably seems obvious to you, but just in case it's not obvious, I just want to say that you don't have to feel like you have to pigeonhole your game into one of these categories. Or on the flip side of that, you don't have to obey the quote rules of one of these categories. So for instance, one of these flavors of fantasy they talk about is epic fantasy. So if you decide that your campaign is epic fantasy, that doesn't mean that you have to do everything that epic fantasy does. That doesn't mean that you can't pull in elements from sword and sorcery or whatever into your campaign. These are just tools to approach some of the variation out there as far as how you can run a campaign and how you can present a fantasy game. So I really suggest that you approach it in that way, you think of it that way, and you use it that way. These are tools to be used to help you maybe pin down what exactly you want to do with your game and give you ideas. But they should not be viewed as any kind of authority or rules that you have to follow, or your game has to fit in one of these categories and it can't violate that or anything like that. So, when it comes to running a game, there are no authorities. Even the rules themselves, even the Dungeons and Dragons books themselves, the DMG, the Player's Handbook, the Monster Manual are the beginning of the journey. They're not the end. Jeremy Crawford, the rules lead for D&D, says all the time that what your GM says goes. The rules are there for guidance. Sage advice is there for guidance. Jeremy answering questions on Twitter is there for guidance. At the end of the day, you're the GM. Do what you want. Do what makes sense for you. Do what works for your group. Do what works for the story you're telling. Don't let yourself be limited by the books or the rules or what anyone else says or thinks you should be doing. So now that you have permission to do what you want, if you needed it there, I just gave it to you. Let's talk about these flavors of fantasy. So again, this is chapter 1 of the DMG. We're starting on page 38, and this is the end of chapter 1. Dungeons and Dragons is a fantasy game, but that broad category encompasses a lot of variety. Many different flavors of fantasy exist in fiction and film. Do you want a horrific campaign inspired by the works of H.P. Lovecraft or Clark Ashton Smith? Do you envision a world of muscled barbarians and nimble thieves along the lines of the classic sword and sorcery books by Robert E. Howard and Fritz Leiber? Your choice can have an impact on the flavor of your campaign. So we start out with heroic fantasy, which is the baseline assumed by the D&D rules and the core books. The Player's Handbook describes this baseline: a multitude of humanoid races coexist with humans in fantastic worlds. So right here, I'll just point out that, again, this isn't the end-all be-all source of defining genres and subgenres. So just because you don't have a multitude of humanoid races doesn't mean that it isn't heroic fantasy, doesn't mean it can't be heroic fantasy. So you got to take all this stuff with a grain of salt. These aren't literature PhDs writing these books. And even if they were, it's still just really an opinion when it comes down to these subgenres. Adventurers bring magical powers to bear against monstrous threats they face. These characters typically come from ordinary backgrounds, but something compels them into an adventuring life. The adventurers are the heroes of the campaign, but they might not be truly heroic, instead pursuing this life for selfish reasons. Technology and society are based on medieval norms, though the culture isn't necessarily European. Campaigns often revolve around delving into ancient dungeons in search of treasure or in an effort to destroy monsters or villains. So another thing they do with these, they have a very self-serving thing I think that they do is each of these flavors of fantasy, they then give you examples of what they think that would be. But those examples all come from D&D and things that Wizards of the Coast publish. So they're not necessarily giving you the best example of this. They're giving you the best example they could think of that's something that they published. So keep that in mind too. I thought about trying to come up with my own examples for these, but I finally decided it's so subjective that honestly what I would recommend to you is if you're wanting to dig into one of these subgenres, go online, do some Google searches, and find varying sources of what different people think are good representations or examples of that subgenre. Don't just go by what's in the DMG and be limited to stuff that Wizards publishes, and don't just go by what one person or one source or one website says, because this is very subjective and people will categorize things in different ways. So to really wrap your head around it and really understand it, if you want to, you need to look at information from various sources. Of course, that's really true with any kind of research you do. But this podcast isn't about how to do research, at least not today. So I'm going to skip a lot of these, especially when they recommend novels, because frankly, I don't think that the official D&D novels are great novels. And honestly, you could find much better examples of fantasy fiction out there than the D&D novels. So I'm going to skip a lot of that. But for heroic fantasy, they say that Forgotten Realms is heroic fantasy. So we could argue that, I think. But that's what they think, or whoever wrote this section, that's what he or she thinks. But again, if you want to learn more about heroic fantasy, go online, do some digging, and find some heroic fantasy novels, and find one that sounds interesting and read it. Next, we have before I go on, I just want to real quickly point out they mention here, and I read it. They mentioned something about that heroic fantasies, technology, and society are based on medieval norms. I think keyword there is based. So even if you take this as word from on high that you must live by when you run your game, it's only based on medieval norms. It's not a simulation of medieval history. So just because, for instance, doors in medieval Europe, for the most part, didn't have hinges, doesn't mean that your doors in your fantasy world can't have hinges. Because, real medieval Europe didn't have dwarves, who are usually seen as being better at crafting and engineering than humans and the other races. Medieval Europe also didn't have magic. So there's two really good reasons why the doors in your world might have hinges. So a lot of times it can be fun to research actual medieval history, and I do it myself a lot to get ideas for your game. But again, don't let that limit you. Don't feel like you have to be constrained by medieval history. If you want to have black powder in your games and you want to have, flintlock pistols and stuff like that, do it. It doesn't matter that they didn't have flintlock pistols in medieval Europe, because you're not running a medieval Europe game. You're running a D&D game. So just a little tangent there, but kind of a common theme on this show is you're the GM. You get to do what you want. You get to decide what the rules are. So don't let anyone tell you different. Do what you want to do. All right, so next we have Sword and Sorcery. A grim, hulking fighter disembowels the high priest of the serpent god on his own altar. A laughing rogue spends ill-gotten gains on cheap wine and filthy taverns. Hardy adventurers venture into the unexplored jungle in search of the fabled city of Golden Mass. A sword and sorcery campaign emulates some of the classic works of fantasy fiction, a tradition that goes back to the roots of the game. Here you'll find a dark, gritty world of evil sorcerers and decadent cities, where the protagonists are motivated more by greed and self-interest than by altruistic virtue. Fighter, rogue, and barbarian characters tend to be more common than wizards, clerics, or paladins. In such a pulp fantasy setting, those who wield magic often symbolize the decadence and corruption of civilization, and wizards are the classic villains of these settings. Magic items are therefore rare and often dangerous. So, sword and sorcery, I always think of Conan, who's kind of the example of sword and sorcery, at least in my mind. Then we have epic fantasy, which is very popular this day and age, at least when it comes to fantasy literature. A devout paladin in gleaming plate armor braces her lance as she charges a dragon. Bidding farewell to his dear love, a noble wizard sets forth on a quest to close the gate to the nine hells that has opened in the remote wilderness. A close-knit band of loyal friends strives to overcome the forces of a tyrannical overlord. An epic fantasy campaign emphasizes the conflict between good and evil as a prominent element of the game, with the adventurers more or less squarely on the side of good. These characters are heroes in the best sense, driven by a higher purpose. I just found a typo. I believe what they mean to say is driven more by a higher purpose than selfish gain or ambition, and facing incredible dangers without blinking. Characters might struggle with moral quandaries, fighting the evil tendencies within themselves as well as the evil that threatens the world. And the stories of these campaigns often include an element of romance, tragic affairs between star-crossed lovers, passion that transcends even death, and chaste adoration between devout knights and monarchs and the nobles they serve. So, one thing I want to point out here about these different subgenres of fantasy is each of these genres has certain tropes that are associated with that genre. And that's a good thing to be aware of if you're really wanting to capture the feel of a specific genre. So, for instance, epic fantasy, which is a genre I'm fairly familiar with, so I feel comfortable talking about, has a lot of tropes that are very particular to epic fantasy, which doesn't mean that you have to use those tropes or cliches in some cases, but you can. And if you're really wanting to make your game feel like an epic fantasy, you might want to. So one of those tropes is the trope of a prophecy. So a great example of this, and one of the times that I've seen this done really well, is my favorite fantasy series, The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. And that series uses the epic fantasy trope of prophecy quite a bit. It's a very fundamental part of the story. There's various prophecies about what's going to happen. And as you read through the story, you see these prophecies come to fruition. Another trope of epic fantasy is world-affecting or world-spanning conflict. And again, The Wheel of Time is a great example of this, where you have nations fighting against nations, and ultimately, all the nations trying to come together against a greater evil. You see something like this in Game of Thrones, although I'm not sure that I would call Game of Thrones epic fantasy. Again, this is all very subjective, so it's something you can discuss. You can get together with a group of your friends and have a debate about what subgenre you think Game of Thrones is, or should it be its own subgenre, But really, I mean, these are just tools to help us describe things, right? It's not something we should get bogged down in trying to label these things. They're just ways to help you describe and understand things. So if I tell you, my setting is low fantasy, then you don't know exactly what I mean by that, because everybody's probably got their own idea of what is and isn't low fantasy. But you probably would assume that, well, there's probably little or no magic, or at the very least, magic is rare and, not everybody has encountered it. There may not be a lot of fantastical monsters and things like that. There might not be so much of the really kind of cheesecake stuff. I don't know what to call it, of like outer planes and teleportation and polymorphing and all this crazy stuff, and dragons that can talk and cast spells and all this stuff. So just by telling you it's low fantasy, it gives you some ideas. But again, because these terms are so subjective, you still don't know exactly what I mean. It still is going to take a conversation to really nail down, well, what exactly is my low fantasy setting like? So, just some things to keep in mind. And, you gotta take all of this for what it is and not try to make it what it isn't. So let's see. I was talking about cliches and tropes of epic fantasy. Another common trope is, and I guess it's a lot of times ties into the prophecy, but the idea of a hero. And a lot of times this hero is prophesied, is foretold. This one person or maybe a group of people would probably be more equivalent or more appropriate for an RPG, who are supposed to save the world or bring about some great change or something like that. So that's another trope that you see in epic fantasy. Another trope that you see is lots of travel, lots of going from one, not just one place to another, but one culture to another. Again, the Wheel of Time is a great example of this. There are a lot of different cultures that you encounter during that story, and you see a lot of different variations on, epic fantasy cultures, basically. So, basically my point is, if you're just using this for inspiration, then fine, don't worry about it. But if you're, for whatever reason, if you're really trying to catch a certain feel, for instance, another one we're going to talk about here in a minute is dark fantasy, right? So if you want that dark fantasy feel, then you can learn about the tropes of that subgenre, and you can use those tropes as tools to help you create that feel by using those tropes in your adventures and in your game. Next, we have mythic fantasy. While an angry god tries time and again to destroy him, a clever rogue, Odysseus, makes the long journey home from war. Braving the terrifying guardians of the underworld, a noble warrior ventures into the darkness to retrieve the soul of her lost love. If I could talk. Calling on their divine heritage, a group of demigods undertake 12 labors to win the gods' blessings for other mortals. A mythic fantasy campaign draws on the themes and stories of ancient myth and legend, from Gilgamesh, the Odyssey, the Iliad. Adventurers attempt mighty feats of legend, aided or hindered by the gods or their agents, and they might have divine blood themselves. The monsters and villains they face probably have a similar origin. The Minotaur in the dungeon isn't just another bull-headed humanoid, but the Minotaur, misbegotten offspring of a philandering god. Adventurers might lead the heroes through a series of trials to the realms of the gods in search of a gift or favor. Such a campaign can draw on the myths and legends of any culture, not just the familiar Greek tales. And, another thing to keep in mind here is you can kind of cross the lines here. I think they talk about this later. They call it crossing the streams. You can combine these. So you could combine epic fantasy with mythic fantasy. You could have this epic, world-spanning story, but pull in elements of mythic fantasy, like, for instance, that, the gods are involved in and things like that. And I would say, I don't know what the scholars say, but I would say that the Iliad and the Odyssey together are both an epic tale and a mythic tale. And I hope they're epic because they're epic poems. So, that's an example of a story that combines elements of both of these. All right. And I just mentioned a minute ago, we have dark fantasy. Vampires brood on the battlements of their accursed castles. Necromancers toil in dark dungeons to create horrid servants made of dead flesh. Devils corrupt the innocent, and werewolves prowl the night. All of these elements evoke horrific aspects of the fantasy genre. If you want to put a horror spin on your campaign, you have plenty of material to work with. The Monster Manual is full of creatures that perfectly suit a storyline of supernatural horror. The most important element of such a campaign, though, isn't covered by the rules. A dark fantasy setting requires an atmosphere of building dread, created through careful pacing and evocative description. Your players contribute too. They have to be willing to embrace the mood you're trying to evoke. Whether you want to run a full-fledged dark fantasy campaign or a single creepy adventure, you should discuss your plans with the players ahead of time to make sure they're on board. Horror can be intense and personal, and not everyone is comfortable with such a game. And also, you want your players to be on board because otherwise it's not going to work. With a horror game, that's especially true. It's probably true to some degree to any game you want to run. If your players aren't on board, it's going to be hard to make it work. But with horror, you really need them on board because I think it's very common, maybe even universal, for us when we're playing role-playing games, for it to be a fairly lighthearted affair. People make jokes, people laugh, people have a good time. Any actual play I can think of that I've ever heard or seen has been like this. It's not serious business. It's a fun game, right? So a true horror game, if you're really going to be super anal about it being dark and brooding the whole time, goes against that trend and goes against that assumption that probably the players are making coming into it. They're assuming that they can joke around, that they can make wisecracks, that their characters can do goofy things, and it's going to be okay. So, first of all, you want them to know that, hey, that's not going to be okay in this campaign. And second of all, you want to make sure that the players are down for that because, you can't do it without the players participating, right? You can't have a dark and brooding game if the players don't want to have a dark and brooding game because it's going to be up to the players not to make jokes at the wrong times and things like that. So especially with the dark fantasy or horror, I really think it's important to make sure that the players are on board for that and are willing to do it before you commit a bunch of energy to creating this campaign that may turn into a farce, which may not have been what you were wanting. So, I think it can always be helpful to discuss what you're planning with the players if you know who the players are going to be. But yeah, especially with something where you want a very specific tone, and not just horror, but any campaign where you want a very specific tone, the players have to help you with that because, you're only one voice at the table. They're, however many players you have, so they outnumber you. So they're going to have more influence on the tone of the game than you do. So if you want a specific tone, whether that's a more dark and brooding horror tone, or you want a comedic, you want to do a Douglas Adams or Terry Pratchett kind of game, or Monty Python, whatever your tone is that you're going for, you're going to be far more successful if the players are down for that and the players are working to help you create and maintain that tone throughout your game. So get your players on board. It'll help you out a lot.
This is Matthew Colville, and you're listening to Game Master's Journey.
I want to take a minute to give a quick shout out to the patrons of Starwalker Studios. The support of the patrons makes this show possible. If you enjoy Game Master's Journey and you'd like to give a little back, becoming a patron is a great way to do so. It's because of the patrons that all the listeners of Game Master's Journey enjoy a bonus episode every month, as well as the monthly Game Master's Journey live stream. So really 2 bonus episodes every month. I'd also like to give a huge shout out and thank you to my Tier 5 patron, Steve. Let's hear it for Steve. Yeah.
Woo, Steve! Yes!
You the man.
thank you so much, Steve, and thank you to all the patrons. You can find out more about becoming a patron by clicking on the Patreon button at the top of the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com. All right, getting back to the DMG, talking about flavors of fantasy today. So our next one we've got in here is intrigue. The corrupt vizier schemes with the baron's oldest daughter to assassinate the baron. A hobgoblin army sends doppelganger spies to infiltrate the city before the invasion. At the embassy ball, the spy in the royal court makes contact with his employer. Political intrigue, espionage, sabotage, and similar cloak and dagger activities can provide the basis for an exciting D&D campaign. In this kind of game, the characters might care more about skill training and making contacts than about attack spells and magic weapons. Role-playing and social interaction take on greater importance than combat, and the party might go for several sessions without seeing a monster. Again, make sure your players know ahead of time that you want to run this kind of campaign, and make sure that they want to play in that kind of campaign. Otherwise, a player might create a defense-focused dwarf paladin only to find he is out of place among half-elf diplomats and tiefling spies. Yeah, so that's another great point too. Also, when it comes to character creation, certain character types are going to fit really well into certain campaign types and others won't. So, that's another good reason to let the players know what to expect. So, another use for this tool of these flavors of fantasy is if you are recruiting players for a campaign, you can use these to help you explain to the players what kind of campaign you want to run and what to expect. So maybe you're posting on a forum somewhere recruiting for a campaign, you want to tell them that it's dark fantasy or it's going to be lots of intrigue. And then the players can know, whether this is a campaign that they're interested in or not. Next, we have mystery. Who stole 3 legendary magic weapons and hid them away in a remote dungeon, leaving a cryptic clue to their location? Who placed the Duke into a magical slumber, and what can be done to awaken him? Who murdered the guildmaster, and how did the killer get into the guild's locked vault? A mystery-themed campaign puts the characters in the role of investigators, perhaps traveling from town to town to crack tough cases the local authorities can't handle. Such a campaign emphasizes puzzles and problem solving in addition to combat prowess. A larger mystery might even set the stage for the whole campaign. Why did someone kill the character's mentor, setting them on the path of adventure? Who really controls the cult of the Red Hand? In this case, the characters might uncover clues to the greater mystery only once in a while. Individual adventures might be at best tangentially related to that theme. A diet of nothing but puzzles can become frustrating, so be sure to mix up the kinds of encounters you present. And yeah, again, you can mix and match these and, you can vary the theme from adventure to adventure. Your whole campaign doesn't have to be a mystery. You could just have a single adventure or a series of adventures that are a mystery. It's always good to mix it up. Swashbuckling. Rapier-wielding sailors fight off boarding Sahuagin. Ghouls lurk in derelict ships, waiting to devour treasure hunters. Dashing rogues and charming paladins weave their way through palace intrigues and leap from balconies onto waiting horses below. The swashbuckling adventures of pirates and musketeers suggest opportunities for a dynamic campaign. The characters typically spend more time in cities, royal courts, and seafaring vessels than in dungeon delves, making interaction skills important, though not to the extent of a pure intrigue campaign. Nevertheless, the heroes might end up in classic dungeon situations, such as searching storm sewers beneath the palace to find the evil duke's hidden chambers. Next, we have war. So again, these are more types of adventures or campaigns you could run than they are really subgenres of fantasy, which is why this is kind of like 2 different ideas kind of smashed together. A hobgoblin army marches toward the city, leading elephants and giants to batter down the stronghold's walls and ramparts. Dragons wheel above a barbarian horde, scattering enemies as the raging warriors cut a swath through field and forest. Salamanders muster at an Afridi's command, poised to assault an astral fortress.
Warfare in a fantasy world is rife with opportunities for adventure. A war campaign isn't generally concerned with the specifics of troop movements, but instead focuses on the heroes whose actions turn the tide of battle. The characters carry out specific missions, capture a magical standard that empowers undead armies, gather reinforcements to break a siege, or cut through the enemy's flank to reach a demonic commander. In other situations, the party supports the larger army by holding a strategic location until reinforcements arrive, killing enemy scouts before they can report, or cutting off supply lines. Information gathering and diplomatic missions can supplement the more combat-oriented adventures. So yeah, I mean, you could easily do a campaign where you have more war-focused adventures and then more intrigue-focused adventures. You could work some mysteries in there. You could throw in some dark fantasy. You know, I think dark fantasy works great at the lower levels because for whatever reason, there's a lot of various types of undead at the lower CRs when you look through the monster manual. So it's really easy to come up with a horror adventure for lower level characters. So, you know, again, you can use all kinds of these in a single campaign. There's no reason you have to get married to one of them and never stray from that one genre. All right, next we have Wuxia. I'm not sure how you say this word, but you know what I'm talking about. When a sensei disappears mysteriously, her young students must take her place and hunt down the Oni terrorizing their village. Accomplished heroes, masters of their respective martial arts, return home to free their village from an evil hobgoblin warlord. The Rakshasa, master of a nearby monastery, performs rituals to raise troubled ghosts from their rest. A campaign that draws on elements of Asian martial arts movies is a perfect match for D&D. Players can define the appearance of their characters and gear however they like for the campaign. It doesn't matter mechanically. And spells need only minor flavor changes so that they better reflect such a setting. For example, when the characters use spells or special abilities that teleport them short distances, they actually make high-flying acrobatic leaps. Ability checks to climb don't involve careful searching for holds, but let characters bounce up walls or from tree to tree. Obviously, someone had just watched Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon when they wrote this. Where are we? Warriors stun their opponents by striking pressure points. Flavorful descriptions of actions in the game don't change the nuts and bolts of the rules, but they make all the difference in the feel of a campaign. Similarly, a class doesn't need new rules to reflect a cultural influence. A new name can do the trick. A traditional Chinese Wuxia hero might be a paladin who has a sword called the Oath of Vengeance, while a Japanese samurai might be a paladin with a particular oath of devotion, Bushido, that includes fealty to a lord among its tenets. A ninja is a monk who pursues the way of shadow. Whether called a wujen, a tsukai, or a swami, a wizard, sorcerer, or warlock character works just fine in a game inspired by medieval Asian cultures. And then they go on to give you a little chart of weapon names that you can use in a campaign like this. So if you want to do a more Asian flavored campaign, you don't need to create a whole bunch of new weapons. You can use the weapons in the player's handbook and just use different names for them. So this chart is on page 41. So if you're wanting to do this kind of campaign, or maybe you're wanting to play like a monk character that comes from a far off land and want to use more Japanese or Chinese inspired weapons, then you can look at this chart. So for instance, let's find our old favorite, the katana. It's just a longsword. You don't need new rules. Just call it a katana. The 5e rules are not nitty gritty enough that there needs to be a mechanical difference between a longsword and a katana. So yeah, there you go. And then finally, we have Crossing the Streams. Let's see here. Okay, so the renowned paladin of Merland from the world of Oerth, from Greyhawk, dresses in the traditional garb of Earth's Old West and wears a pair of 6-shooters strapped to his waist. The Mace of St. Cuthbert, a holy weapon belonging to Greyhawk's god of justice, found its way to the Victoria and Albert Museum in London in 1985. Somewhere in the barrier peaks of Oerth, the wreckage of a spacefaring vessel is said to lie, with bizarre alien life forms and strange items of technology on board. And the famous wizard Elminster of the Forgotten Realms has been said to make occasional appearances in the kitchen of Canadian writer Ed Greenwood, where he is sometimes joined by wizards from the worlds of Oerth and Krynn. So, you probably hearing this either think this sounds super cool or super dumb. So if you think it sounds super cool, you could try something like that. Just make sure that you don't have any players that think it's super dumb, because it's going to be hard to get buy-in from a player if they think it's super dumb. Deep in D&D's roots are elements of science fiction and science fantasy, and your campaign might draw on those sources as well. It's okay to send your characters hurtling through a magic mirror to Lewis Carroll's Wonderland, put them aboard a ship traveling between the stars, or set your campaign in a far future world where laser blasters and magic missiles exist side by side. The possibilities are limitless. Chapter 9, Dungeon Master's Workshop, provides tools for exploring these possibilities. I will just make one correction here, in my opinion. They say it's okay to do this. I would say it can be okay to do this. It's not just across the board okay to do this. A lot comes down to execution. Brett and I talked about that a couple weeks ago. Really, I think the difference between a railroad adventure and a non-railroad adventure doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the adventure. It has to do with the DM and that DM's execution. I think you could take a given encounter or adventure, have two different GMs run the same adventure, and one GM runs it very, very railroady and the players feel railroaded. The other GM runs it and the players feel like they had agency the whole time and they chose every step of the way where they were going and what they were doing. So really, it comes down to execution. So if you can pull off one of these combination things well, and make it not seem ridiculous and stupid, and have player buy-in and have your players have a good time, then that's awesome. Go for it. But not every attempt at that is successful. And the more you go outside of the box in a way like that, the more challenging it's going to be to pull that off well. So, just understand, if you're going to do something like that, it's going to be more difficult to pull off than sticking with a more familiar genre that people have encountered before. So, I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying think about what you're doing and evaluate your ability as a GM and ask yourself, can I pull this off or not? And if you're not sure, I don't know. Well, for one thing, whether you're sure or not, definitely ask the players, because this is where you'll lose players with this kind of thing. You may not. I mean, you may get a little disgruntlement from a player if you're going to run a dark fantasy game and they come expecting epic or mythic fantasy or something like that. I mean, you definitely can get disgruntled players that way, which is why it's good to communicate these things to the players. But you're much more likely to get disgruntled players when you do something like that, especially if they don't know it's coming. And especially, of course, if you don't pull it off very well. I think I've told the story before on the show. When this happened to me as a player, when I was much younger, I made a character to play in a D&D game, and I made a half-elf fighter mage. And this was an archetype, I guess you could say. This was a type of character I'd been wanting to play for a long time. I've been wanting to play a fighter mage character, partly because I had a player play one in one of my games I ran, and I thought the character was really a lot of fun and thought it would be a lot of fun to play. So I make this character and we start the adventure, and during the course of, I think it was the first adventure, it might have been the second adventure, or the first session, I should say. Long story short, it was something out of like the movie, I think was it Fire in the Sky? It was basically Fire in the Sky. Like my character got abducted onto an alien spaceship and had to escape this alien
spaceship, and I hated it. I think part of the reason I hated it was because the DM totally blindsided me with it. Like, I didn't know going into this campaign that this is what it was going to be. I didn't know it was going to turn into a sci-fi game. If I did, I never would have made a fighter mage character, because one of my biggest problems with it was I felt like my character didn't fit in the campaign. Like, I'm like, if my character were like a rogue and found myself on this alien ship, that could be cool. Especially if I was like a really smart rogue and maybe could start to figure out some of the tech or whatever. But being a wizard, steeped in magic and mysticism, to suddenly be thrust into a world of science and science fiction, it broke the game for me. It broke the fourth wall. It just broke everything. It was like, this character doesn't fit in this story, and this is the character I'm playing. And, I think if the DM would have told me ahead of time what was going to happen, or said, hey, this is going to be kind of a mix with sci-fi, honestly, I probably would have just said, well, I'll pass. I'm not really interested in that. But if I would have played, I think it would have gone over better, because at least I would have known what was coming, and I could have made a character that fit that better. But even so, I don't think I would have liked it. So, I guess I'm using that as an example of one, you have a better chance of success if you warn the players ahead of time, especially before they make their character, so their character can fit the thing that you want to do. But two, some players just aren't going to like it. And that, I think it's especially true for these, putting the Old West in your fantasy game or whatever, doing these kind of juxtapositions of very different genres together. I think you're more likely to have players that don't like that with that. But even just really focusing on one of these subgenres of fantasy, you can have that. You could have a player coming in wanting to play a mythic, epic campaign, and you want to run a very political intrigue, low fantasy campaign. And it's not what that player is looking for. So, really this all comes down to communication. So I think that this discussion here in the DMG is helpful. It's not exhaustive. This is not the source to learn about the different flavors of fantasy. I would definitely recommend you go other places, but it's a start, and it can get you thinking about, what exactly am I doing? How would I describe what I'm doing to the players, so that we're all on the same page as far as what's going to happen in this campaign? And I think, what we should assume as GMs, especially for D&D, is that players are going to come to the table expecting, heroic fantasy and or epic fantasy and or mythic fantasy and or even sword and sorcery. So if you're doing any of those things, it's going to align with your player expectations and assumptions probably pretty well. But if you're going to go outside of that very much, whether you're going into, you're going to use sci-fi stuff or Old West stuff, or you're going to do a different time period, maybe you're going to do more like a steampunk kind of thing, or you're going to do dark fantasy or wuxia or wuxia or however the hell you say it, or something like that. If you're going to go too far outside of that kind of assumption we make in the core books of D&D, the farther beyond that assumption you go, the more important I think it is that you let the players know ahead of time, because you may have players that just don't want that and are just going to say, you know what, I don't want to play in that campaign, right? And if you have a player that doesn't like horror and would say, I don't want to play in your horror D&D campaign, you don't want that player at your table anyway, because they're not going to have fun. So you're kind of wasting their time, right? And you and the other players aren't going to have as much fun if you've got, this wet blanket at the table who's not into it, right? So it's like you're wasting their time and they're wasting your time, and you're both wasting everybody else's time. So, I know not everybody does a session zero, and you don't need a session zero to do this. You just, when people start making characters, just tell them, hey, look, this is kind of the general kind of what my campaign's going to be as far as what type of fantasy or what type of time period this is based on, or whatever.
if you've come up with this campaign, then you know what your influences are, what your inspirations are. So just share that with the players to help them know what to expect and know, one, is this a game I want to play in? And B, what character do I want to play in that kind of story? Because the kind of character, like they mentioned in the book, the kind of character I want to play in a mythic fantasy story where we're traveling around battling monsters might be very different from the character I want to play in a very swashbuckling intrigue story, right? The first story, I might want to play like a wizard. In the second story, I might want to play a rogue, because I think I would have more fun with a rogue in the swashbuckling intrigue campaign, or a bard. And I think I would have more fun with a wizard in the let's go fight a bunch of crazy monsters campaign. So it's better for you and everybody if you can communicate this as well as possible. And kind of the barrier here, I think, is everybody being on the same page and using these terms and being able to explain from the DMG, this is what I mean by mythic, this is what I mean by epic, this is what I mean by swashbuckling. Then it allows you all to kind of use the same vocabulary and everybody to be on the same page, and everybody knows what you're talking about and can decide accordingly. So yeah, I think this is useful. But again, this is just the tip of a very large iceberg. And if you're interested in more, definitely do some digging and exploring beyond the DMG. There's lots of great information out there. All right, well, that's going to wrap it up for episode 175 of Game Master's Journey. If you'd like to get a hold of me, please visit the website starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey. There you can find my email address, my Twitter, Google+, Facebook, Pinterest, YouTube, all that good stuff. You can also find the Trickster's Labyrinth, my D&D adventure, for sale there. You can find a link to our store on Spreadshirt where you can get yourself a Game Master's Journey t-shirt. And you can find the Game Master's Journey voicemail number where you can call and leave me a message. If your question or feedback is entertaining or enlightening or both, you might even hear your message on the show. Played one last week, I think it was. If you have any questions, feedback, suggestions for future topics, I'd love to hear from you. You can also at starwalkerstudios.com find the link to our Discord server if you'd like to join us over on Discord. You can also find a link to the Game Master's Journey community where you can share ideas with other listener GMs. And finally, you can learn about how you can support this show by becoming a patron, by making a one-time donation, by using my Amazon referral link when you shop on Amazon, by getting yourself a Game Master's Journey t-shirt, or by purchasing my D&D adventure, The Trickster's Labyrinth. You can find all that and more at starwalkerstudios.com. I hope you have a chance to play your favorite RPG this week. I hope you have a chance to run your favorite RPG. I'll be back soon with another episode of Game Master's Journey. Until then, game on.
This has been a Starwalker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music, courtesy of Cloudwalker, Transboy, Renfield, Stanko, and Ish. See the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey.